Oh, God.
It says you're talking about that first.
Today?
That's what it says on the, that's what it said in the script. That's why I was asking.
Friday, last Saturday night.
I can take it out of the script.
Yeah, I hadn't planned on doing
So Tammy put us together because we're coffee drinkers, so apparently we are bad catches.
I'm just going by what the script said. I had nothing to do with it.
that. You know, put that in the script, that I'm going over mixing and stuff?
Pam's the one who did the script. I didn't know, do we not want her?
Yeah, I don't have anything to put.
Okay, then I'll take it out.
No, I think that Judy was going to discuss something about mixing associates, so maybe,
No, she's not.
I think that she was gonna discuss dates for potential workshops.
Judy?
Do you have a second, Judy?
So I did. I'm sorry, I don't know. The first 2 minutes was most embarrassing.
Okay, okay,
And
scratch
as
it.
I watched it, yeah, Dan looked like
Judy, we can scratch that, so we have them working on dates for workshop. I don't think we had to discuss that here. So, no, no mixing.
Okay, so that's off. So that means Cindy, you're gonna be up first?
I'm good.
No, legislative platform. Who's gonna lead legislative platform?
at all.
No,
He's not organized. He has no platform. He has
Who's
no.
gonna take the lead on legislative platform?
I guess maybe that's why there's some frustration.
So did I, but I'm looking at the agenda.
Well,
We need to
Okay.
be the ones coming up with ideas.
I didn't have anything set. This was something John wanted to talk about, was legislative. You wanted to talk about legislative, I had nothing set for legislative platform.
No,
well, I would normally do it, but apparently we're going to do it a different way, so it kind of leaves me out of it.
Okay, we'll just start that one, okay?
leave you out
So
of it.
Cindy, who just stepped out, I have her up first then.
Well, I think we should talk about it as what happens with, so everybody understands what we're doing with the legislative platform, which is what you're doing.
Correct, so I was
So-
gonna bring that as a board item, right? And I was gonna like explain it all. Yeah. At that.
Oh, okay.
Desmond, how do you want me to do this?
He wants you to take that off now. Take that off.
Legislative platform out.
Okay, so you want me to do, Cindy just stepped out, so,
Yeah, we need to
I
discuss
didn't
it.
realize DA was on here.
But I thought we were
But I
gonna.
guess she,
she was expecting that.
Sorry. Hey, you see where Cindy went?
You know, and at that time I had
Cindy,
Here she is. Here she is.
Are you prepared, are you planning to talk about differentiated accountability? I think we're all. Are you planning to talk, you're actually gonna be first up?
Okay.
yeah, this is on our agenda for Friday. Workshops and board meetings.
Great. Okay, let's count down, let's just do it. We'll muddle through. Ready?
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Good morning. The board workshop for September 14th, 2015 is now in session. Tammy, roll call, please.
Ms. Nixie?
Here.
Ms. Emerson?
Here.
Mr. Siegler?
Present.
Mr. Craig?
Present.
Ms. Feldman?
Present.
Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, this workshop has been called for the opportunity to hear a report about differentiated accountability and to review policy 7120. So, Mrs. Van Meter, can't wait to learn more about differentiated accountability.
I should have done a Korean postcast.
Gee, I'm so
I would have
disappointed.
had my parents opt me out.
Yeah, the board has decided to opt out.
Mr. Ziegler, we learn from those assessments. So, you know, we've had conversation over the past year with some folks who have not really understood what DA or differentiated accountability stands for and what it means when the state partners with us. So I thought this would just be a good opportunity with new board members, because we're coming up on a year and then I won't be able to say that anymore. So I thought this would just be a good opportunity to share some information with you. We belong to what is called the Region 3 District Accountability Office, and it has changed over time. There was a time when a team of 15 to 20 people would come in to visit the schools, but that has really decreased over the last few years. I want you to know that our team is led by Dr. Ella Thompson, and she truly is here to provide support to our district and to our schools. And the schools do have the opportunity to say, I don't want to participate in this, but no one ever does. In fact, this last year, Endeavor, who really has showed great progress working with the DA group, was given the opportunity to actually go on their own. And Mr. Wilson said, no, I really value another pair of eyes from outside of the district taking a look at what we're doing. So that's where we are. They stay with us. They continue to offer support and to look for continuous improvement in our schools. I referenced Dr. Thompson. She's probably been with us for 4 years now, and she truly is a partner with Brevard Public Schools. She works with helping develop leadership in the school. She works really hard on developing teachers in the schools, and everything that we do is focused on student outcome. So there's 3 categories for differentiated accountability, and those are prevent. Those are any schools that have a C. There's focus schools, any schools that have a D, and then there's our priority schools that have an F. So let's take a look at our C schools. Now, it's sort of old information because you know this year we haven't yet received our grades. So we're going back from the 13-14 year, and we're just sticking with those schools that were listed at that time. And you can see that most of them are elementary schools, and then we have 5 middle schools that earned a C. But it's really not even a complete picture, because you know this was the year that some of our schools were protected by not dropping more than 1 letter grade. So this is the list that came from the state, but you'll see that we have some other schools that we've involved in this process just because we know that they need our help. So DOE doesn't monitor the school improvement process for our C schools. They put that responsibility on the district offices. Things that they consider, they look at the leadership at the school. They looked at the school-based leadership team, and based on some of their input and some of their observations, we've looked at shifting some leaders at schools to other ones where maybe they'll have a chance to make a greater impact. We look at student achievement. We look at educator quality, the teachers that have been at that school for several years, where there might be a large teacher turnover. A lot of things come into place when we're looking at what schools we're going to place our support in. Of course, the schools, the teachers in these schools have to be highly qualified, and they have to be in field. We take a look at their performance appraisals. We look at the professional development training that they've had. And these are all things that the DA and the district work together and will weigh in on as soon as we decide where we're going to be putting our support. So then we have our focus schools. And these are schools that currently have a grade of D. And it's Endeavor and Gulfview. and Madison Middle School. Again, there's other schools that would have qualified in a D or an F school, but they didn't because of that safe harbor where they could only drop one letter grade that 1 year. So what do we look at in our focus schools? Here's where the DA team actually does get involved. They take an active role in looking at ways that we can look at improving performance in that school. But the big thing that they do is they also monitor the district support that goes into those schools. And they're constantly looking at, they keep holding up a pretend mirror and they say, look in the mirror. What is it that you need to do differently to support those schools? And they ask very hard questions of us. And they don't take no for an answer. And they just expect us to do everything it is that those particular schools need if they have a hope of improving in the future. So that's what our team does regularly. We meet with the folks from DA once a month, and I will tell you it is a room full. We've had to shift our locations because we ran out of chairs. It is all of the directors, all of the area superintendents, our school improvement office of 1, our accountability office of 2, and we look at ways that we can support. We bring in the folks from professional development, we bring in Dr. Pace, and we know that Dane and Judy are available if something's going to need to be done with facilities or cost money. That's when we get them involved.
Cindy, you have a question?
I have a question.
So you've included, in your discussion right now, everybody's included in discussing how to improve the schools, but you didn't mention the teachers. So do the teachers in some way get to say what would help them do a better job, and then you all get together? Because that piece seems to be missing.
I'm going to show you as we get later in our presentation what actually happens in the schools.
Okay.
Okay. This year, for example, when DA came, well, I'll get to that slide shortly. So we had one priority school, and that was one F school, and that was Brevard Virtual School. And since that time, well, let me tell you a little background. Their grade was based on 36 children. 36 children in grades 3 through 7. So think about it a little bit, that there was probably not 10 kids in any one grade level. They were spread out over that 3rd through 7th grade. And at that time, in that virtual program that Heather Price was using, all of the instruction was done by the parents. And it was totally up to the parents whether or not the children even followed through with the work that was required of them. It was totally parent-driven. She has since closed that e-school and gone to a different model where the parents have to understand that they have a responsibility. And if they do not follow through in the work that is required of them, then they are withdrawn from that program and they have to look for another program outside of the BVIP program that Heather Price has. It would have been, you know, our school grade, our district grade is based on those A's through F's. And at that time, that would have been one of the only school that kept us from being a highly performing school district. And so that was the direction that Heather had to move in. The parents had to accept the responsibility for educating their children. So you'll see that Brevard Virtual, that school is no longer part of our program. So our priority schools, and this was truly a huge learning experience, not just for us, but for the DA group also. Because how do you implement practices when there are no teachers? The parents are the teachers. And you can't expect and monitor their progress when the parents don't have to provide that information to them. So they've been looking at models across the state on how to better put in systems of monitoring virtual programs, but we've moved in a different direction, so Heather does have more buy-in from the parents if they want to be part of the Brevard virtual program.
Cindy, can I stop you for just 1 second before we
Sure.
get too far? Do you know off the top of your head how many of those prevent schools would have been focus or priority schools without the safety net?
I can get you that information, but I'd rather not give it to you off the top of my head because I'm not sure. There's so many different scenarios that we looked at, but I do have a report on my desk that shows you what schools earned and what they should have earned if there was no safety net. I'll send that to you.
Thanks.
Other
But-
questions?
But at the
Cindy?
same time, that was the year that they raised the cut scores, correct?
It was.
So therefore, as I understand it, we had some schools that even though they raised the cut scores, they increased the rigor of the test, there were actually some schools that increased their score, but was still below the cut score, so their grades went down. So when we have that conversation about how do we help the teachers, we got to do that very sensitively because some of those teachers did a better job in a tougher situation, and then for us to turn around and say, well, now we got to help them because they didn't, we've got to be very sensitive about how we address that.
And you are spot on. In fact, that particular year, Mr. Ziegler, Endeavor took a dive in their points, even though their student achievement showed great improvement. And I'll tell you, that morning, Dr. Bingley actually went and met with those teachers the first day back, and he reiterated exactly what you said, that year the changes in the accountability was truly not a measure of how those teachers and those students performed at Endeavor. He absolutely took that into consideration as we move forward in having those conversations. You know, we took probably our harshest look at some schools that actually dropped below the points earned at Endeavor. We had a couple schools that scored less points than them, yet their grade was still 2 letters higher than them. Those are some of the things we looked at as we started moving forward as far as what schools really needed the support from the district. You're spot on. So what happened this year with differentiated accountability? They were driven by race to the top dollars. And I told you at one time we had a team of 15 that would come in and work with us in our schools. And this year we have a team of 2. And so we had to be very selective in the path that we chose on how we can best serve the schools that are most needed. And when Dr. Thompson came to us and we had this conversation, she was the one who clearly stated, we've been doing this for several years. And our staff is trained, and they are really experts now in doing these deep dives into the data at the school, into doing classroom walkthroughs, into looking for standard-based instruction. So this year, their focus is more on holding district accountable, so because we're already in a good place where we know what we need to do to support the schools. So this year, as I said in the PowerPoint, their focus is truly on the D's and the F schools. But again, we made some decision points there because Endeavor's a D school. But they've been getting the support from DA for several years, and they didn't need that in-depth training that comes with the DA schools. They will have just some superficial visits from DA, some walkthroughs from DA, but as far as the weekly or the monthly meetings, they don't feel it's necessary to do that any longer. So we're looking at focusing on the Florida Continuous Improvement Model. And this model continues to focus on lesson plans, testing benchmarks, and always being ready to adjust what you're doing based on the results that you get from some of those assessments that you do. That's what's supposed to drive your instruction. We have created curriculum pacing guides to help the teachers know where they should be at a certain time. It is not what you should be doing today, but it's what you should be doing within a 3 or 4 week span. What do you have to accomplish so you're on track for the assessment at the end of the school year? We do a lot of progress monitoring. If you go into one of those elementary schools, the principals ask them to see their data walls. They will take you into a room that is just covered with data about their children, how they move from one area into another based on their progress that they're making on a day-to-day basis. And that is, you know, informal assessments, more formal assessments, but always how does the teacher make adjustments based on the needs of those children?
Okay, I have a question about this slide.
Surely.
On this slide, all I see is kids in these schools are getting tested like crazy.
Remember, I didn't say formative assessment. These are summative assessments. They can be exit slips. They do have to somehow monitor whether or not the child is learning the standards. And based on those results, they either have to do some remediation or they will push them forward.
Okay, it just concerns me that
It is
we're
not-
testing these kids to death.
Remember, Ms. Nisi, in all honesty, our assessments in our elementary schools have actually decreased, and that was based on a conversation that Ms. Henderson had, I think that was 2 years ago. Elementary programs went in and they reduced the number of benchmark assessments that they were doing. And so again, you know, it all depends on the child. There are some children that probably will need some more progress monitoring. It really is on a student-by-student basis is what they're looking at.
Well, when I see the word assessment in this slide over and over, it just concerns me that this child's no longer a child, but a test score.
No, they're not. But you have to have some assessment in order to understand where that child is in their needs for instruction.
Okay.
There are no additional assessments put in there.
It's just important to me we don't lose the focus that this is a child.
Absolutely. Mhm. So, this year we had 3 focus schools in Brevard. I told you earlier that they were Endeavor, Gulfview, and Madison. The DA, though, gave us the opportunity, if we didn't want to put all of our eggs in that basket and send the team repeatedly into those 3 schools, we could make that adjustment. Again, Brevard Virtual was the only priority school, and then there were 2 other schools that we thought had a concern from us, and that was Mims Elementary and University Park Elementary. Not on the list, but because they were held harmless that year, they really would have been if their points were taken into consideration. So this is what we looked at when we were deciding where to focus those 2 priority folks from DA. We looked at Endeavor, and they have been doing well over the years, and they asked that we pull back a little with the DA visits at their school. We looked at Gulfview, and Gulfview is one of the middle range schools. The principal is going to retire at the end of this year, and they will need some additional support going in next year when we have a change in administration. So we're staying the course with them, knowing that next year we might have to put a little more effort in at that school as the administration changes. We really looked at Madison Middle School, and based on their performance data, this truly is one of our priority schools. This is where we're putting a big amount of our focus. They have had this year a change in administration. So far it has had some positive results. We've been looking at a lot of surveys that their teachers did when they came back at the beginning of this year, and we're really moving forward with what we can do to support the teachers at Madison Middle School. Again, I told you that Brevard Virtual had some changes, so we're not putting a lot of focus in there at all because Heather has a plan in place, and she knows that they won't find themselves in that F range ever again. Mims Elementary is a school that if we had looked at points, they would have actually been lower than Endeavor, so we're putting a great deal of district support at Mims Elementary School. And then University Park has been a DA school for several years. We don't want to not continue focusing on that school, but they already have a lot of the strategies in place, so we're just going to continue monitoring and supporting them as they ask for the need. So with the Regional Executive Director and Brevard Public Schools, the focus of our support this next year is going to be with Madison, with Mims, with Gulfview, and with University Park. Those are our 4 schools that we're putting all of our efforts into. You know that school improvement resource teacher is Janet Stevenson, and Janet does a lot of work in those schools along with district resource teachers. She will be creating the district improvement and assistant plan, which is required from DOE. She does a checklist for the districts on the focus and priority schools. She is our liaison, and she's going to come up in a few minutes and just walk you through one experience at a school. And then she also is responsible for monitoring and submitting to the state all of the school improvement plans.
Cindy, while she's doing that, the one thing I keep jotting down is you talk about, you know, you're going in and building capacity and, you know, you use a lot of broad terms. Can you be more specific?
I'm going to.
Because when I hear those things, the other question that comes to mind is I picture as a classroom teacher, a district coming in and giving me more to do.
And that's not what happens, but I have some I used 2 schools as an example in the back, and I wanted to get to that in a few minutes. So the DA, what are they going to do? They're changing their way. They're not going to be spending their time in the schools. They are going to respond to our district, our urgent needs, and they will be providing training to district staff and to school staff that need some improvement so that they can have a change in student results. You know, our focus, we've been talking for 2 years, 3 years on standard-based instruction. But the depth of standard-based instruction and the rigor of standard-based instruction, and that is still one of the places that we come up short. When we go in and we visit classrooms, they'll make reference to a standard that they're teaching, but it's very superficial. It's not deep enough that our children will be successful. So that is the training that we're going to be providing. We started last year and we'll be continuing with it this year. I put down PD to practice. You know, we provide a lot of professional development for our teachers, but we don't always go in and support them as they try to implement it in the classroom. And you know, when you go in that first time and you're implementing something new, rarely does it work the right way the first time. And what we want to do is make sure that the teachers know that we understand that, but what did you do right? What did you do wrong? What do we need to tweak? How can we help you so you don't give up on this new professional development opportunity that you've learned? We want to make sure that they know we're there to support them, to model, to help them, give them feedback about what we saw when we were in the classroom. So just putting that professional development into practice. And then they have to have strategic goal setting, and that really has become one of our big focuses this year, especially as we move forward with our strategic plan. But having them set goal setting and targets for their classroom, for their students, for their school. Now, Dr. Thompson did come and she met with Dr. Blackburn, and I think he gave her a good hour of his time that day. And she just really wanted to get a sense of what he thought about the DA participation in our schools. And I think if you read some of his statements, basically he'll tell you that if it works, he will support it. If it's getting in the way of progress in those classrooms or of good instruction, then he won't support the DA coming into our schools. But I assured him, as did Janet and the other folks in our committee, they have truly made a big difference in eyes from outside of the district, taking a look at what's happening in those schools. You know, first of all, you know, no teacher, any teacher is going to be uncomfortable when a team of 3 or 4 people come into your classroom. But the folks have provided really strong feedback to them that they can then take back and tweak what they're doing or modify some of the lessons that they're having so they involve students in a different way. So there's, once they get comfortable with the people, they have been very welcoming to the DA being involved in the improvement in their school. So this next year, though, when we know that there's only a team of 2 working with us, we really focused in on Dr. Blackburn's statement about you cannot lead a school around the principal. You have to develop the principal if you want to see change in the school. So here's what we're doing this next year. Because of the reduction, we are going to, as far as professional development, we're going to cluster schools together and try to get more bang for our buck when we do our training. Since last summer, we have been doing more of the train-the-trainer models in the schools, whether it is someone who was doing work on Performance Matters, or last summer we did trainers for the reading programs. We know that our staff here at the district is just spread too thin. You know, I say this all the time. Lynn Spadaccini has one science teacher to work in 53 schools, and he truthfully has done such an amazing job. He has developed a cadre of 15 to 20 teachers that work closely with him, and then they go out and do a training with a lot of the science teachers in the schools. He knows that he just can't do it on his own. And that's pretty much what all of the resource teachers are doing. They're building cadres of teachers who want to take leadership role in their school and who want to do training for other, not just their school, but other schools in their feeder chain. So our next steps, the DA has come in. They have provided training to district staff on resources, on item specification, on standards-based instruction. And the next thing they're working on is helping us develop an instructional review process so we can go in and do some review of the instructional practice at the schools. They are helping us, they're discussing a risk factor analysis so we can go in and see what is impacting the learning in the school. And then the regional director has asked if she could come to one of our leadership team meetings so she can see some of the training that we do here at the district for our principals, and then it gets rolled down into the schools. So I kept talking back to one of the trainings that we did in the schools, one of the assessments we did at the school, and for example, here's Endeavor. And this is what came out of Endeavor. School leadership, they talked about what their expectations are, and a lot of it is about data and providing data to their teachers and providing training to their teachers so they can better utilize the data that is now in what we refer to as Performance Matters. It's a new analytics program that lets teachers hone in on their students, on what their past progress has been, and where their weaknesses and where their strengths are. At Endeavor, these are all decisions that they made together. They have asked to
Who's
implement
they?
a common reading intervention program.
Who's they?
The entire staff.
Okay.
Their teachers have asked for training on the use of math manipulatives. They know that this is one of the places that they're struggling. Their science and social studies have asked could they do more in the ELA content so they can make sure that science and social studies is including English language arts skills at the same time. Their coaches are going to do more modeling. And then again, here they wanted to focus on establishing that PD to practice. They want to make sure that the professional development they receive is getting put into place in the school, and they have created timelines, they have asked for classroom walkthroughs, and they really want some additional support for their new teachers at the school. And then in the right-hand side, I gave you some of the things that the district leadership will do to support those needs at Endeavor. Madison was very different. What they're looking for at their school is different because Endeavor has been on this path for 3 or 4 years. They're looking at, again, I'm referring to that data system. Performance Matters came into the district last August, and everyone has had an opportunity to dabble with it, but they haven't been able to use it as deeply as they might have if they had some additional training. So they keep asking for us to come in and do some professional development on Performance Matters. They, again, have focused on standards-based instruction. They need more professional development on how to make sure they're getting into the rigor of the standards and teaching them as fully as they should be. And then the one thing they talked about is that they believe that they need buy-in from all of their staff members, that all of their children can be successful. So they are going to, they want to have more involvement in hiring of new teachers. This summer when they did the hiring, they did it as a team. They brought in all the folks that wanted to participate, for example, in hiring a math teacher. They brought the math team in and gave them an opportunity to weigh in on the hiring practices. And then again, I referenced the onboarding training. They're afraid that when new folks come on board, they're just sort of, here's your book, here's your classroom, have at it. They've asked that there can be more formalized training for the new folks coming into the school. And then again, what the district's responsibility is with Madison. And we have one of these for all of the schools that the DA has been working with. Gulfview, University Park. I just wanted to give you a couple examples. If you want one specific to your area, I'd be happy to supply that to you. So I have one for Mims, Coquina, Gulfview, and University Park. So the other thing that we look at when we're trying to decide who gets the support, and this, I know you've heard reference of senior staff a lot, but we've created what we call junior staff. And it is the area superintendents, the folks from testing and accountability, the folks from HR, from labor relations, let's see, Beth Fetty's group, Student Services, Donna Boberski, ESE. And they all get to weigh in on where they might see problems arising out in the district and how they can offer support to schools. So some of the things they're looking at are the answers to these questions. How current is the principal that's at that school? And is this their first time being a principal, or were they a transfer in and they do have some experience? How does the attendance rate at that school compare to the other schools in the district? How does the discipline rate at that school compare to other schools in the district? What % of the teachers have less than 1 year experience, have only been teaching 1 year? What % of their teachers have 3 or more years of experience teaching? And then we decided we're going to take a look at the absentee rate of teachers. Is it higher at this school than at other schools? And if so, why? And what is it that they need that we're probably not supporting them? So these are schools outside of those DA-focused prevent priority schools, but other ones that we're taking a look at to see if there's any issues that we think we need to step in and say, how can we help you? And just so you know that on those district reports, we're comparing elementary to elementary, middle to middle, and high school to high school, because the range is very differently, and holding an elementary to the same standards as high school, we're not interested in doing that. So any questions for me before I have Janet come up? Go ahead, Ms. Nisi.
So I go back to my last question. When you go to a school and say, how can we help you? Primarily, you're looking at professional development and observation. I mean, I guess when I'm saying the help is telling them what they need to be doing for themselves is what I'm hearing, whether that's in training, whether that's looking from the outside in, telling them what's missing. When you specify how can we help you, that's what I'm primarily hearing, is by identifying their weaknesses and providing professional development is what I'm hearing is the primary.
And that's just a piece of it. We also do a needs assessment survey that the schools fill out and each teacher fills out. So if they say, I need more training in this area, whether it's on performance matters, whether it's on standard-based instruction, differentiated instruction, teachers get to also indicate what they might need. If they need more hands-on activities in math classes, then we'll have our math folks go in. It really is an opportunity for them to weigh in on any additional training they have. You know, we have limited so much now. We've cut back on professional development days and leaving them in their building, and we try really hard. We don't feel that it's best to pay for a sub for them to come up here and be trained, because then the students lose in those opportunities. So we will come to them, whether it's with feeder chain groups, whether it's some meetings after school at the early release Wednesdays. We really are responsive to what it is the teacher needs or the principal needs or this classroom walkthrough team may target as a need.
So how much money of the district goes for this program?
This doesn't cost the district any money.
But the training does.
It's our people that will do the training.
What about for the subs? If there's subs?
If we take them out of the classroom, then yes, that costs money. And that was, if it's originated at the school at their request, then a lot of the times the principals have that in their sub-budget plan for some professional development.
So if this program wasn't in place, where would schools, there are schools that aren't identified that have these issues. Are there other ways to go about having a needs assessment and training outside of this program?
You know, they all do a needs assessment in their school as far as what professional development they'd like to see coming down the path. And we have, the area superintendents will come to the junior staff and they'll say, can I take a team in and do some walkthroughs at this school? It's been requested. And so a team of folks from the district will go in at the request of that principal and do classroom walkthroughs at that school. And based on what information they gather, that might target the need of some particular professional development, but that's at the request of the school or sometimes at the request of the area superintendent.
Okay, anybody else?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, go 1, 2, 3.
In some of these schools, and I will just pick on Endeavor, there sometimes is a turnover in teachers. And it's come to my attention that sometimes we hire brand-new teachers, like first-year teachers for a school like that, which in and of itself is not a bad thing, but they get in there and after 3 months they leave because their intern was at a Freedom 7.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, instead of, if they had interned at a Title I school, then maybe they would understand and be more empathetic to the whole issue. But if you are interning at one type of school and actually working in another type, it comes as a little shock. And then what happens is 3 months in, we're having to get another teacher in that school, which then disrupts those students' lives. And of course, we don't know how long that teacher is going to stay. And so part of that, for me, is not the continuity for some of these kids in having teachers either with experience or teachers that are going to stay there long enough. That's just my input.
You know, a couple things that Deborah Pace's office has really been targeting. They have truly looked at giving an opportunity for students who do their internship at a like school to, based on that principal's recommendation, some of them get hired on very quickly because they have been successful in a like school. You know, I look at, I will tell you, and this is just anecdotal information, over the last 4 years, that has really changed at Endeavor. You know, his first year, his first summer, it was tough looking for teachers to come in and replace teachers that have left. But I'll tell you, this summer was very different. And that happens when they have faith in what's happening at the school and with that principal. This year, hiring for him was not a huge issue, and he's been able to better target exactly who brings with them some experiences in like programs. He's done a very good job, and it has decreased over the years.
And then to just expound on that just a little bit, when it comes to classes that are oversized and that we know we need another teacher for a particular grade level, these are the very schools that we need to get those teachers in early. And I understand we have a process, but if we already have a struggling school, then it would seem to me it's in the student's best interest. If we know that we only have 3 classes and we need 5, we need to do that sooner than later.
You are exactly right. And I will tell you that, for example, this summer, Rashad was very tied into Jane Klein, even when she wanted to go on vacation. And she then was very tied into Deborah, because they did let them have a little more leeway than maybe other schools would have, because they know that that potential is coming down the road, and they would rather be up front of it than lagging behind. Now, this year, Rashad would say to us, I promise you, when I come to 6-day count, those people will be there, and that's exactly what did happen. So, you know, he knows his school, he knows his community, and so that's the part that we have to start listening.
Oh, and I'm not just talking about his school.
No, I know.
At this point, I'm talking about all schools in this position.
Yes, you are right.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay, Misty?
I have a couple fairly quick, I believe. Do we provide monetary incentive for teachers that are teaching at the schools that are in the DA process?
Do we provide what?
Monetary incentives for those teachers. Do they get supplements for working at the struggling schools?
Well, Deborah?
Last year, we negotiated with the union the $150 supplement for our DNF schools as well as for our Title I schools and some of the.
It's not very much.
For all of them, it depends on their status, but there is a small monetary incentive for that.
Okay, I thought I remembered something about that, thank you. My other question is there any variance in staffing allocations? I know we talk about going in and providing professional development and you know, helping to shape leadership and looking at instruction and all of those things. But do we apply the same cookie cutter allocation to our struggling schools as we apply to the other schools?
You know, the DA schools, the Ds and the Fs, they have to get additional support. So they have to get a full-time reading coach, a math coach, and a science coach. So they do get that. The prevent schools, the ones in the C category, they do not. And again, you know, Ms. Belford, keep in mind that things were crazy 2 years ago with that safety net because it helped them retain their grade, but then it hurt them in that they couldn't get all of the support they needed because they were a B or a C. So it's something that we had to take a look at.
Thank you.
Mr. Craig?
Back at the beginning, you talked about some specifics about the prevent schools, and I wrote down a comment about teachers in field and out of field.
Yes.
Well, can you just reiterate what you said there?
That they have to be certified for what they're teaching. They have to be in field.
Okay, and how does that apply to ESOL?
Oh, Deborah, ESOL, if they get a student who is an ESOL child and they don't have that certification, they have a certain window in which to add it to their certificate.
Okay, because I had this conversation, you know, in our last board meeting agenda, you know, I had a question and I talked to Dr. Pace about this, but you know, there was, I think, 30 ESOL waivers on our agenda, and a full third of them were at Gulfview, and they were all teachers that are very, very senior teachers, been there for years, that came from other schools, been at Gulfview now for 3 years or so since a couple of schools closed. And so I just wonder where the correlation, is there a correlation for ESOL in the DA's agenda? Do they look at that? To me, there seems to be some sort of correlation between the fact, in fact, we looked at the numbers of students that qualified for ESOL, and I think it had tripled at Gulfview just in the last year and a half, I believe it was. It had skyrocketed. So it seems like there may be an issue there as well, and I don't know how this is able to address that.
We're responsible for monitoring the in-fieldness of a teacher. And I know, Deborah, it's English, depending on what the teacher teaches as far as how long they have to get that ESOL certification.
One of the things that we have put across the table with BFT is some language that would require our teachers who signed agreements in 1995 to, over the course of the next 2 years, make sure that they've met those ESOL requirements. Because as our demographics shift, it's becoming more and more of a need. You know, Gulfview is a very great example of the increase in ELL students that we're experiencing. Some of our teachers had a little bit of a comfort level because we had so few that they didn't necessarily go through with the entire process of getting the endorsement that they needed, or depending on if it's a secondary, it might only be 60 hours, otherwise it might be the full 300. We are offering, again, those programs free through our professional development office. We even offer a week-long intensive course for somebody who's desperately in need to get certified pretty quickly, where we pay for the substitute for that class. But that is something that's going to be a big push from us over the next 2 years to try to make sure that we get everybody certified. The problem now is that you might have 1 or 2 teachers per grade level who have what's required. So either they're getting all of the ESOL kids, or if the principal is trying hard to spread that out and help all to be successful, then you have more teachers reflected in that out-of-field report. And on the next board meeting agenda, you'll see a larger number.
Larger number. So I guess going back then, is it something that you look at? You know, you made the comment that we determined that they need our help. Is that something that?
I will tell you, Mr. Craig, we have not. But
It seems like there's probably a correlation
that might be
in
a
the fact
good-
that maybe the kids aren't understanding what it is they're supposed to learn.
good Q8 we will put up there.
Okay.
But I can say that those schools are prioritized for that week-long training intensive course that we offer, getting teachers into that.
Okay. And I had one other question, Ms. Van Meter. How do you, as a staff, evaluate the effectiveness of this differentiated accountability program?
You know, and that was another thing I had on my list to bring to you. We gather data. I know it sounds awful based on assessments. I'm sorry, Ms. Nacy. But, you know, we look at whether or not they're showing improvement. Our goal is to get them out of that prevent, priority, focus category to get them up into the A-B range. And the only way we do that is by impact in classroom instruction. And so we monitor that the teachers are teaching the standards, that they're adjusting their curriculum based on the needs of their population, and then we provide them the support that they need as far as whether it's modeling, whether it's professional development. We react to what it is the school asks of us, and then we monitor their student performance.
Okay.
Is that it? Karen said you wanted to talk.
You want to talk now?
And then I want Janet I want to put a name to a face. She is our DA queen.
Okay,
So-
Dr. Blackburn wanted to comment?
So I don't know, is this on?
Yeah, you just have to talk right up on it.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. I don't know if I should talk now because I have so many thoughts and opinions around this topic, and I'm trying real hard to listen and learn before being critical and offering change, unless there is a burning building, right? And I've articulated that to most people and the board. This is an area, if we have quote-unquote failing or underperforming schools, and within those schools we have some children who are really hurting, then it's about as close to a burning building as I think we're going to get. Now, I want to qualify some of my thoughts around the fact that my experience with differentiated accountability is pretty rich. It started in August of 2008, that summer before the 08-09 school year, as an attempt to bring synergy between two different accountability systems. One, the A+ plan here in Florida, and then two, the NCLB federal legislation that governed school accountability. It was supposed to be a pilot in, I believe, 6 states, and Florida was one of the 6 states. To the terms you see there, priority and prevent, and there was another term, there were correct 1, correct 2, intervene was the lowest level you could get. It was an attempt to take each state's grading system, combine it with the NCLB, and produce one way of categorizing schools and then providing support and intervention, right? Well, again, one of 6 pilot states, it was supposed to go nationwide. It didn't. There's been a constant decrease in kind of state resources with this. So for the example that Ms. Van Meter made, last year the regional executive director had a staff of
14 or 15.
14, 15, 16, right? And now there's a staff of, Cindy? 2.
How does that work?
Right. So there's been a reduction in that state allocation of resource, which for me is okay because I'll go into my thoughts, right? Schools reform, I think, from the inside out, not the outside in, right? Parents and teachers and partners coming together, rallied by a principal with clear thought, clear vision, right, who can execute all of that. And the rest of us really need to provide support I like the question you asked, Mr. Craig. I think you were saying, because I was thinking the same thing, how do we evaluate the level of support that we provide? So how am I evaluated against what I'm supposed to provide to a school like Endeavor or MIMS or any other school that's in that category? And also, how's the rest of the system organized around that? I don't see a priority school as the quote-unquote concern. I think the 1 or 2 or 3 priority schools inform us that we have some systemic pockets that we need to shore up, as opposed to focusing in on 1 or 2 or 3, because you can't overcome what the system is providing to you or not providing to you, right? So I'm a firm believer that I need to look district-wide. For example, if I say that so much of school reform is based on how a principal is interacting with parents and teachers and rallying them, focusing them, et cetera, then that's what I need to measure. Like, what's the existence of that type of leadership in a school? If I articulate that the system ought to organize itself and provide true strategic resources in addition to that type of high-level leadership, not instead of, because sometimes the district or the state will try to provide resources instead of having a highly effective leader in a school, and I'm telling you, that's just bad money after bad. You won't go anywhere without having the leader in the school that can carry most of the water, right? And that we support. So if all of that is important, then it has to be like measured, and we have to hold ourselves accountable for that support and fixing systemic weaknesses, and we have to hold leadership responsible for being leaders. And another one, you know, again, going back to differentiated accountability, the Florida Continuous Improvement Model, I think they all come from some very noble places, but they are very much assessment driven, and that's kind of the format that we are given. And there tends to be an absence in dealing with what I call root cause, and that is culture and leadership in the school. I did sit in with the regional executive director, and I'll be honest in my statement, I wanted to sit in on that conversation because I don't have the best experiences with the state-directed kind of accountability plan. So I wanted to make sure that we didn't have teachers and principals here in Brevard that were trying to be creative and innovative and actually being held back by this type of system, because I've seen that done before. I was assured of that prior to my meeting, and I was reinforced in the meeting with the state, so I felt somewhat of a comfort level there. But I will tell you, we started talking about what types of supports were going to go into these schools, and I started asking some questions, right? So what types of supports have been going into these schools previously? And they were kind of the same, but then there was this one school, and I hate to single out schools, but we're here now. So there was this one school called Endeavor that was kind of making strides, perhaps more strides than some of the others. And so if the same or similar levels of support are being applied to multiple schools, but one is standing out, then that tells me it's not necessarily the support, but there's something going on in that school, in that community, that's allowing them to kind of stand or separate themselves, and we need to find out what that is. And if these, and it was basically around culture, right? So I don't think it's a wise idea to apply professional development, reading, curricular support where we may have a less than effective overall school culture in existence, right? And if culture is the problem, then we support and emphasize culture, and then once that is on sound footing, then we can apply some of the other support systems. And if the state is unable to provide adequate support around culture and leadership, then I would recommend that we not just waste that teacher or that principal's time. If, just deal with kind of root cause issues. Those are my thoughts around differentiated accountability and just accountability in general. So again, it is on my radar to look at what we're doing for at-risk children and at-risk schools. But like I said, it starts first at the system level. What are we doing for all? What kind of leadership do we expect in every school? What kind of culture do we expect in every school, right? We need to know that first, support that, emphasize it, evaluate that first, and then pick out pockets where that's lacking, shore it up. Where the leadership and culture is great, and we have some of those schools, right? Leadership and culture is great, but performance is still lagging behind. That's a place where we want to give until it hurts, right, in terms of resources. But where culture and leadership is not where it needs to be, we need to focus on that first.
Agreed.
Just some thoughts.
I like your thoughts.
Love what you say. And I guess that's my concern about some of the programs we do is we just keep hitting with the things we can measure. I know one of the things that Brian used to say is that some of the things we need to, some of the best things we do are not things we can measure. And culture is hard to measure, but sometimes it has the greatest impact. And so I wholeheartedly support that. So Janet, those are awfully big words to follow, but I know Janet.
No pressure.
I know Janet quite well. We've worked together at what used to be called Brevard Community College, but please, and I'll let you introduce yourself to the board.
Good morning, board members. Dr. Blackburn, Janet Stevenson, School Improvement Resource Teacher. And I just wanted to say that you all are asking the right questions, because the questions you asked are the same questions that Dr. Thompson has asked us. How will we be impacting systems change? Are we aligning our resources? That's kind of their whole mantra, is looking across our district and developing effective systems, because solving problems one school at a time, it will not be an effective use of our resources. So that's where we're trying to challenge ourselves as a district, is to become more effective systems-wide, both in our use of coaches and providing support to our principals and so forth. And so some of the things we have taken on is last year when we had schools new to the DA process, we did form a principal collaborative team. So principals of schools who've been in DA for a while, principals of schools that were in Prevent, could collaborate and ask their questions in a safe environment of each other, sometime with no leadership there of their supervisor, so that they could feel comfortable getting their questions answered and receiving support. Some of my main experiences that I just wanted to share with you in a short amount of time is rarely, if not at all, does the state ever come in and tell schools what to do. When we are walking classrooms, we are walking classrooms with the eye for evidence of, does their school improvement plan, which is a workable document, that's the shift we've experienced in the past few years, is developing plans that are working, breathable documents where at our lowest performing schools, we are on a weekly or bi-weekly basis evaluating the steps in those school improvement plans and seeing if they're working, because we know our students do not benefit from plans where we don't see any impact happening, and we know time is of the essence. So we are evaluating our next steps all the time to see if the changes we're making is having an impact. And typically what the room would look like is it's a room full of instructional coaches from that school, the leadership, often the area superintendents or coordinator, and myself, discussing if the steps we've outlined is getting us the results we wanted, and if not, the state is asking questions of us, saying, what will help us get us there? What are we hearing from the teachers? And typically, a lot of the cries or the words we hear from teachers now is they're getting better at knowing the standards, and they are saying, I need to see it. If I could see it, I could do it better. And that's a lot of our next steps in these schools, is getting brainstorming different ways teachers could have to collaborate, to get feedback, to observe others, and that's been a primary way of work with the instructional coaching support, and then at the district level, finding avenues to support the coaches in a systemic way to have the training they need to support the teachers. And then the layer on top of that is finding ways to support our principals and effectively using their coaches so that they can make sure they are maximizing their time. So anyway, that's just a quick view of DA from my perspective, and I'm open to any questions. Yes, Dr. Blackburn.
Hey there, thank you. Quick question. You mentioned that in some of these, I guess, Q&A sessions you conduct with the principal, sometimes the supervisor isn't there. Could you?
Well, they're support sessions, so they are sessions where principals would meet on a voluntary basis to get support from each other, people who have walked in their shoes prior to them. Ms. Hudson at Coquina, Mr. Wilson at Endeavor, they are providing, Mrs. Insminger and from University Park are providing support to our principals who may be new in the turnaround world. And so when I say the administrator, sometimes I go by some feedback I get from principals, and sometimes they feel like they could discuss things better without a supervisor there. I want to tell you that our supervisors, there was a member of the administrative team at pretty much every meeting, unless time or other matters prevented them. But yes, so.
So there's not a, so I guess what I'm trying to figure out is if there's a situation where a principal is asking for support from the district, is that done in collaboration with their supervisor or without the supervisor?
No, if they're asking support, they're asking for support from their supervisor.
Got it.
I'm there to facilitate support of each other through setting up the time and place. Once they get there, I let their needs drive the meeting.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Craig?
Sorry, so that kind of piques a question for me. How do we integrate our top performing schools in a peer-to-peer relationship to make sure that we have mentorship, that we have ongoing, rather than just grouping a group of schools together because they happen to fall in a grade? How do we expand that? I mean, or do we, or do, you know, it sounds like we allow them to talk to each other and we encourage that. Do we have outside influence as well? Do we bring in others that have been successful that maybe have moved on and moved from different school to school to a higher performing school? How does that work?
Do any area soups or Ms. Van Meter want to answer? Okay.
You know, Mr. Craig, when you ask that question, I right away think of Miss Mercer, Hyla Mercer at Cambridge. Yep. At one point, she was in that position, and the school showed great improvement, and she worked her way out of that.
And I know she worked with Rashad real well.
Correct.
You know, 'cause their proximity.
And Rashad is always working with Katrina Hudson and the folks up in the Titusville schools. They build those relationships amongst each other. They're not afraid to call and say, hey, what are you doing that's working? And then they get together. You know, we'll put out a communication that this is going to be a topic for discussion. Voluntary, go if you want to. And all of a sudden they'll have 17 to 20 principals in a room trying to learn from each other. So, you know, Deborah creates, as new principals come on board, she creates mentorship programs with them. Folks that are in the beginning new principal program have mentors in a team that they work with that doesn't end once they get a job. And, you know, we're just always looking for opportunities for people to learn from each other and share, you know, their experiences. So anyone who wants it, and sometimes they're tapped on the back and said, you will do this, because they need that little bit of encouragement.
Anybody else? We're good?
Stephanie, any questions? Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, please.
Ms. Van Meter, or Area Soups, or anyone. So I'm listening.
And learning.
And learning, right? And we're definitely talking about the richness of the programs and the interventions and our strategies. But what would we say is missing? Like, what's our opinion on what we've yet to do or yet to uncover or a nut that we've yet to crack when it comes to schools like the ones we're talking about?
I can give you a list of not what we're missing, but, you know, we've just been in certain financial straits over the past few years. You know, to really make a difference in schools, a lot of it is the people and, you know, the extra people to help smaller groups, smaller classes, interventions.
Can I weigh in on that? I've been enjoying my lunches with senior staff, and Jane and I had a conversation last week. Jane, do you mind if I share the idea that you brought up? So I would love to take credit for it, but it was actually because I asked her the same question. What is it that would make your job easier, or get, you know, because I worry about that top down. We spread some people too thin, what you were saying. If you have one resource teacher in some areas in 85 schools, and one of the things that I said would do more of what you said is if the area superintendents had a team of, we called them academic coaches, not resource teachers, academic coaches, where they worked with a group of schools. Instead of having a resource teacher in 85 schools, you know, divide up those resources between our area superintendents and let them direct how they want to intervene with those schools. You know, we're doing as a district what we get irritated with the state doing. It's too much top down as opposed to that local thing. And so instead of having the one district person that does, you know, just jumps from school to school to school to school and tries to get to everybody, let's give somebody like Jane 4 people, and maybe they work in 2 teams of 2, and they can go into a school for several days, or a feeder chain. And they look at we talked about kids that weren't graduating or retention rate, and they work in that feeder chain, and it becomes a systemic issue that they work on as a team that really has an impact, and it brings it down to that level. And I just thought that was a really different way of looking at it, as opposed to always putting resources at the top. Yes, it's resources, but maybe a better way of looking at the resources is that's a way to get people out of district office and out in those schools. And so that was a conversation Jane and I had over lunch that I just want to keep telling you guys, have your senior staff, take them out to lunch, and we get all kinds of good ideas. But that was one I wanted to share that I really thought was worth exploring. Dr. Blackburn?
You know, Ms. Nacy, one other one that Teresa tried, I think this is our second year doing it. She has a resource teacher who goes to the 5 most struggling schools, but she goes 1 day a week to each of those 5 schools. So every Monday she is in the classrooms modeling lessons, then having feedback with that teacher, and then encouraging them to do some teaching that she provides more information on. She has made such a difference in the way that the teachers are teaching, and they're so appreciative of that. But she couldn't do it if she was going to the 54 schools.
Exactly.
She goes to 5 schools, and she focuses 1 day a week at that school to the entire staff, and it has been most beneficial. Oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't Teresa's. Teresa's paying for it, but it's Lynn's teacher. Okay, so.
Because you're right, the one-shot deals just don't work.
No. Anyone, Teresa, Lynn, anything else you want to say? I'm not looking. If Lynn gets up here, we'll be here forever.
Yeah, if Lynn gets up there, we know we'll be up there. Sorry, Lynn, we love you, but we have a whole nother, I know Stephanie loves talking to the board, so we don't want to be able to leave her out. Anything else from the board? Does anyone need a couple minutes bathroom break before we go into the next topic? Or just a break? 2 minutes, okay. I just want it noted that it's not the women asking for the break, it's the men asking for the break. So 2-minute break. Okay, so 4-minute break.
Were you an instructor?
Okay. You guys ready?
I just retired. I can't
Okay,
remember his
5
name.
minutes more than that.
But he thinks he knows you as a disruptor.
Because I know Stephanie loves talking to the board, so I certainly don't want to disappoint her.
Oh, is it Chris Richard?
Harold's going to come for executive session.
He just emailed me. I
Isn't
didn't
he?
know it was you that was.
Harold was notified of our executive session,
He was
right?
just renting for a few months or something.
Yeah.
Tim,
Tammy, Harold was
Yeah, nice
notified of
guy.
our
He was
executive
fine.
session, right?
Yeah, he was. He worked for me. I ran the weapons school up in Oceana. He was one
Yeah,
of
he said,
Okay,
I said,
we'll get
I
by.
remember John.
We're good,
I said, oh, there you
did.
go.
because I called it last minute. I called it.
Pretty sure he's
It's
not
my
even
fault.
lieutenant, but, good.
Yeah, I didn't know he was moving
Yeah, I
down.
know. Blame it on me. Okay, guys. You guys ready? 5-second countdown.
Yeah, he took Tomcats.
Oh, you just want to see me move fast.
Okay, welcome back. Hope everyone has their reading glasses because we're back to the small print. And so Stephanie, you're going to walk us through policy 7120 and answer all of our questions.
Policy 7120.
You're going to have to talk right on top of the microphone.
Okay. Never done this before.
Yeah, you have to get real.
Oh, you
I'm
need
a
to
rookie.
be,
Yeah, you have to be right on top of these to pick up.
Okay. But policy 7120 is how we balance our schools based on our capacity. This affects student enrollment through out-of-area selections for parents. And so I work very closely with Dane's office, who gives us the capacity information. I've put in front of you the list of schools by area for the next 5 years and their capacity levels. When we look at this, we're looking at permanent capacity. And so the process that we go through in order to decide on our selection of schools that are frozen to incoming students or frozen to outcoming are based on this capacity. We look at that very carefully. We come up with a tentative list that I share with senior staff. Then a draft is published to the principals, so they may review to see. Often, the list does change year to year. And I know as a former principal, one year my school would be on it for a couple of years in a row, and then I would be off. And so it's just something we keep a careful eye on. If there's a reason a principal needs to have their schools frozen to incoming students, specialized programs, or frozen to outgoing because they're trying to build their high school programs, to be able to offer more on their master's schedules, you'll see a lot of that in our junior, senior highs. These are discussions they have with their area superintendent, who then brings it back to senior staff, and then we make a collective decision together as to what schools should be on these lists. Obviously, the schools that are over 90% capacity are frozen to incoming, and schools lower than 75% capacity are frozen to outgoing students, I should say. I need to phrase that. Then we publish the list. So that list then is published for all of our parents who are interested in participating in our open enrollment processes and making an application to be a student out of area. In other words, attend a school other than their zone school. So
Okay.
that's the gist of it.
Okay, so I think what I would like to do is first, I know I went through this policy and I wrote some areas that I had some questions on. Maybe we ought to go through it page by page. I'm looking at the board members and ask if there's questions per policy, page by page, and then we'll go from there, if that would be agreeable to everybody. So let's start with page 1. In terms of definitions, are there any questions or concerns when we look at the definitions A through G? Misty?
I just have one question on, and it's not really a question on the definition, but a question of concern around that concept, and that is, how much change do we typically see in student membership between October and the end of the year? Because I know that oftentimes we look at that fall FTE count to make decisions for our schools, and yet if we're in April or May and we've already seen a huge hike in students or a huge decrease in students at particular schools, that doesn't seem to necessarily be taken into account.
February count.
It's the February count that you use, isn't it?
No, we use a projected membership. These are all, the student accommodation plan and the freezing of schools is based on the projected membership for the following year. In other words, Those membership projections are developed by a large group of people and I guess approved in about early November. It's given to the, it's then used to generate the FTE and given to the state officially in November. So those projections are used to either freeze schools or close schools, incoming, outgoing, but those are projections for the following year.
So if on this first page, let's just use from Roy Allen down to West Side. If we were looking at, well, I guess we can just use the whole south area there. If we were looking at 216 to 217, what would you say if that was the projected capacity? Which schools would be frozen to incoming and which would be frozen to outgoing based on that? Just to kind of help. I'm just looking at the first page of this that Stephanie handed out. You see where I'm looking at? Projected capacity, 2016, 2017. What would you be telling us there?
Well, the frozen to incoming would be anything that exceeds 91% or over. So you would be looking at Roy Allen.
Okay.
You would be looking at Harbor City. Or I'm sorry, is that Indy Atlantic? I slipped.
Indy Atlantic.
Indy Atlantic. The next one would be Jupiter. The next one would be McAuliffe. The next one would be Meadow Lane Intermediate, and so on and so on.
Okay. And then outgoing would be?
Anything 74% or lower.
So that would be like Gemini?
It would be...
Palm Bay, Bayside.
Okay.
Right, Gemini would be 68%, correct. So that's the policy, and those are, again, based on projected students for the following year. Now, we wouldn't go out 2 years, obviously. We're just doing this for the...
Yeah, this is just for our discussion
sure.
today, but if this were what staff were looking at in the progression plan, those would be what were frozen, going in, going out.
Yes.
Okay, Karen?
Well, while looking at this, you have two schools right next to each other, one that would be frozen to outgoing, one would be frozen to incoming.
Okay, which could you?
Gemini and Indy Atlantic. And as you look, as the projections go out further years, Indy Atlantic increases and Gemini decreases. So to me, that looks like something that we need to fix with a boundary fix. And I know that's not what we're talking about today, but...
It's on my list, actually.
You know, with that big disparity of 25, you know, to 30% in population with two schools sitting right next to each other, with the freezing part of this policy, seems to me that the fix is not the policy, the fix is the boundary. That's just my...
Yeah, one of my requests, Dane, for you was going to be, would you give the board, because we try to not redistrict more than 5 years each time, and so actually I was going to request discussion about beachside redistricting for the since I've already announced I'm not running, I can take the heat of this next year, and a new person wouldn't have to. But each of the areas, we have other areas that may be in need of redistricting. If you could get to the board members, what year did we redistrict each of the areas, so we know how many years out we've done, like the south area, when we did Viera,
Yes.
when we did north area. I just want, for all of Brevard, when did we redistrict?
Well,
I just want to have that information.
and I appreciate that. However, I've got to say that I'm going to speak for my district. We're going to have a problem in the next few years. We need to, you know, whether it's going to be 5 years or not, we need to at least let the public know what's coming that way because of all the new growth in this area. To me, it's okay to say that sooner than later, to at least say that that's something that we're going to look at. I don't think that we have the imbalance issue at this point from this, like you do on the beach side, because we just balanced all the schools in District 4. Or it seems like we just did. I guess it was a while ago.
Well,
More
and
than
that's-
5 years,
yeah.
yes.
And that's why I want to take a look at when it was done.
But,
Yes.
you know, if it needs to happen, it needs to happen.
So, yeah, so, boy, see, we got to the hot topics, and we're only in page 1. So, okay, anything else? Did that answer your questions, Misty? Okay, anything else on page 1? Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Blackburn. See, we're having fun already.
Question on definition of capacity. Just kind of educate me. We use permanent capacity as the trigger that starts the conversation on a lot of different pieces. Why is that?
Dane, you're on for that one. Would you explain that?
Well, let me, if I may, let me give you an overview on how this policy was developed, and that may help frame the issue. And again, we have some board members that weren't here when this was developed. Back in 2008, there were two concurrent situations, two parallel situations. One, we had a lot of schools with disparities in their enrollment, as Ms. Henderson has pointed out. You had schools with an excess of capacity, or a lot of capacity available, and you had adjacent schools that were overcrowded. At the same time, in 2008, there was the implementation of school concurrency. In other words, the legislature passed the requirement that we the implementation of school concurrency, meaning that schools, as other services had to be concurrent before new development occurred. They had to be capacity of schools before the local governments were allowed to approve development. So we had a couple of policies at that time that kind of addressed it. We had an out-of-area policy. Remember that if you had disparities, sometimes that was caused not only by in-boundary enrollment, but you had students coming from outside the boundary to exacerbate that situation. So we addressed that in, I believe, policy 5120. We also had a policy 7110 called student accommodation, which had some hard stops or hard numbers in there. When you reached 110% of permanent capacity, you would start to consider program changes and other measures for reducing your permanent capacity down to the total or the permanent capacity of the building, your enrollment down to the permanent capacity of the building. When you got to 120%, that policy at the time said that you would build something, you would do something, you would not allow that situation to occur at 120% because of the stress on the core capacity. Neither of those policies addressed in any codified way the new concurrency requirements. Those concurrency requirements were based on permanent capacity. Every district in the state based their level of service on permanent capacity. You could do anything that you want, but to base it, Dr. Blackburn, on total capacity would be to acknowledge that you're ratifying, if you will, what should be a temporary situation. In other words, relocatables are there to solve an immediate problem until you can do something to get it down, get your enrollment down to permanent capacity. So this policy was developed for the first time in 2008 to start to codify in one policy the out-of-area issues, and we refer back to policy 5120 for some of the rules on out-of-area or student rules to remain out-of-area. But this codifies how you when they were allowed to come in, allowed to leave, the over 90 and less than 75. We had some rules, I guess, or local situations that dealt with student or sibling preference. That would be at the schools of choice. We had rules about out-of-area at schools of choice. So the purpose of this policy was to bring all of those disparate issues together in one document that talked about out-of-area, how we handled membership and capacity. You can see that if you go to the very back page, it was adopted in 2008, and that there were changes every year up to 2011. In 2011, and the board members may recall that we, each year, we're trying our very best to address those schools that had 120, 125% of permanent capacity. They had 18, 20 portables there. And we were trying to get it down to 100% because that was our part of the deal in our interlocal agreement with the local governments, that we would, in fact, because of the concurrency policy, the concurrency interlocal agreement, required us to be under 100%. So we had 5 years to get there. It was called a tiered level of service, gave us 5 years to get there. And we were out there trying to rezone, redistrict our students to meet that requirement. As issues arose each year, board members would ask questions, parents would ask questions about why we did things certain ways. We tried to modify the policy each year to address those concerns. In 2011, which was the last change, I believe that most of the issues had been addressed at that point. And more importantly, in 2011, the legislature changed the requirement from permanent capacity. They required in 2011 that portables in fact be used, total capacity be used as a measure for concurrency. So that allowed us to not have to meet in each of our schools 100% level of service. In other words, we were always going to have less than 100% of total capacity because we would be bringing in portables to maintain our schools at about 90, 91, 92% of total capacity. So that relieved the pressure on us to continuously rezone. And I think at that point that for the vast majority, so we basically stopped rezoning at that point. And I think that because we had addressed most of the issues attendant to out of area, that was in fact the last change to the policy. So Dr. Blackburn, I know that went a little beyond your initial question about why we use permanent capacity, but it did start with permanent capacity. That was the basis of the interlocal agreement and the measure of level of service for school concurrency. It no longer is that, and therefore you can change that requirement to total. I would not recommend that we do that because again, then you are institutionalizing, if you will, that temporary situation.
But also, when we had schools that were like at 125% next to a school at 75%, the one that was at 125% started lunch about 10 o'clock in the morning and finished about 1:30 in the afternoon, and school got out at 2:15 because there's just not enough time and space to get all those kids through there. In addition, back then, there was not the requirement to have covered walkways to the portables, and our 2 o'clock or 1:30 in the afternoon thunderstorms would come, and students from the portables would come out and would literally sit in the hallways for the last 30 minutes because we had to get them into the buildings prior to the thunderstorms coming. So there's a lot of other reasons that and there's capacity in other issues. You know, if you have so many sixth grade classes, you know, as you expand the school, then they all can't fit into the music at the same time, and you know, it becomes a scheduling nightmare for the schools. So.
Okay. Does that answer your question?
No, it does.
Your thoughts? I mean, we've lived with this for a while, but I'm, you know, as a new set of eyes on this, your thoughts? It
just appears that permanent capacity is the trigger that begins the conversation, and who knows where the conversation may lead, right?
Well, sometimes it just triggers the conversation. We've found that it triggers the
we don't-
conversation. It doesn't mean we always do anything.
Right. So I'm just wondering whether or not if you added a total capacity to the conversation, would you also add in options for solutions as well? Or are we limited by potential solutions by looking at the permanent only?
What are your thoughts, Dane? See, total capacity changes because we're constantly moving portables. So would that be hard to figure?
But maybe that's not the solution to dealing with it. I think that's where Dr. Blackburn's
Yeah.
going, is that maybe we need to
Oh,
look
can you
at
talk,
it
can
differently.
you talk in the microphone?
Oh, sorry. I think that was Dr. Blackburn's point, is our response to a school reaching 100% of permanent capacity has been, let's move in portables. Maybe that's not the solution.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
we need to look at other solutions to that situation. And I think, if I'm understanding correctly, Dr. Blackburn.
Correct, correct. So before, I've kind of gone through this, before in some other areas. Before I recommend a solution, I would want to know that first I have a legitimate problem. I want to look at a series of options, cost benefit out each option, and then come up with a solution. It just seems like I start to limit my ability to do that when I limit the scope of the, I want to say, alleged problem, if that makes any sense. That's all. So you may end up, with at the same place, but it just seems like looking at the total may add to the conversation.
Can you explain that? In what way? I'm just trying to figure that out.
Okay, so for example, again, reflecting on what I'm hearing, right, in Brevard, if there's a school at 100% permanent capacity, and if that tells us we ought to spend resources on either moving in, no, we wouldn't move in, but let's say we want to add capacity to that, we want to add permanent capacity. Well, if a school is at 100% of permanent, but only say 80% of total, do I necessarily need to build capacity? Is that a quote-unquote need for the system, or a want or a desire for the system?
If I may, Dr. Blackburn, you're exactly right in that question. That's planning. That is capacity planning. What this policy is about is limiting in two ways, but let me talk about the incoming. The intent of this policy is to recognize that the optimum maximum enrollment at a school would be their permanent capacity. And what it's trying to do is to eliminate to the extent possible or restrict incoming out-of-area students, exacerbating the problem. In other words, if you're at 90% of your permanent capacity, which is what this says, and students want to come into that school for convenience, not for programs, because there are dozens or half a dozen exceptions anyways, correct? You can come in for, what used to be AYP, you can come in for district choice programs, you can come in for ESC programs or ESC needs, and
AYP doesn't exist anymore.
I'm sorry, what's the EAP?
McKay.
McKay, you can come in from McKay. So there are, I think they restrict McKay, but the point is that there are many reasons that you can come in. What we're trying to do in this policy is restrict a student from coming in from out of area for convenience and exacerbating that situation where you would have to bring in yet another portable. So the only purpose of this policy is to say, if you've reached a point where we know from experience, from empirical evidence, that we're going to probably have to bring in a portable, we don't want to, we're going to try to restrict students from coming in for convenience and causing a need for an additional portable to maintain that permanent capacity, somewhere below 100%. On the flip side of that, if you have schools that are at low capacity utilization, such as 75%, and students want to leave that school for convenience, thereby exacerbating the problem on the other side, where you're starting to have to eliminate programs or bring in additional units, teaching units for small school. I'm not familiar, but I think they call them small school units. Is that correct? To maintain the program. Is that correct, Cindy? Small school units. So what you don't want to do is have students leave for convenience when the school is at low capacity utilization. You want to try to restrict that. So that's the only intent of this policy. Dr. Blackburn, what you were asking is, or what you were alluding to is kind of planning for capacity and new issues. It goes beyond the scope of this.
Okay.
Maybe we need to step back and, I think I understand where your question is, but explain to us the fish fact, because you're looking, I mean, if we're going to have that as a definition, then we need to know what it is. Okay? We need to know exactly what the fish formula is that's telling us that this is what we're going to drive our policy by. Does that make sense?
Yes. I thought we defined fish in there.
No, it's not in here.
No.
Florida inventory of schoolhouses, it's under A, but it doesn't explain it any further
No,
than
the
that.
fish formula is not in here.
The formula
Well,
itself.
the fish formula, just a quick discussion, is the state's database. The state has a uniform rule. It's called SREF, state standards for state requirements for educational facilities, in which they assign a student capacity, student stations, which convert to student capacity for each type of space. In other words, a primary classroom, intermediate classroom, senior classroom.
But isn't this the same formula that gets us in trouble because they don't take into account how we use the building, which is why
Yes,
which is why
ma'am.
we may be at a 90% capacity
yes.
and still need portables before we reach 100%
Yes, ma'am.
capacity.
But then they adjusted it to a point because of all the districts complaining, for example, a music room being used as permanent seating when in an elementary school, when they're constantly rotating through, you really can't count that. Now, they made some adjustments, and some of our numbers came down because of that. Maybe not to the extent
Right.
you're talking about, but I know that they did make an adjustment about 3 years ago.
They do. But once a school's capacity is determined when it's designed and built in the initial construction, that capacity is set. So there's a state database of fish capacity for a school. There's no formula per se. I mean, there's nothing to put in here other than to refer to the state database.
Well, and I guess that leads me to question then how we define policy based on something that is possibly not even relevant to the individual school because it has changed. You know, school was built 50 years ago, and the capacity of the school is truly just the physical capacity, not the throughput of the customer, of the students, right? That may have changed because of programmatic changes, curriculum changes, whatever the case may be. So I think that goes back to what Dr. Blackburn's asking is that, you know, we're limiting ourselves by saying we're just going to take whatever that fish factor was from 50 years ago and go, well, that's 100%.
Yeah, because even though it makes it easy for us, is it really relevant?
Yeah, and maybe it's not allowing us to look at problems or issues or obstacles to learning before they become an obstacle to that learning. I think that's kind of where Dr. Blackburn is going, because it questions me. I'm like, I see us using a formula or a capacity that was passed down via legacy and is not reevaluated. It is not based on any, by your definition, it's not reevaluated each year.
It is. I'm sorry. Let me clarify that. I think Dr. Not speaking for Dr. Blackburn, but I think what he's trying to do is expand the capacity to try to eliminate the restrictions by incorporating portable capacity or relocatable capacity. Mr. Craig, in response to your question, we in fact every day or every week we go out there and look at the schools. They are updated to the new uses. In other words, as we turn classrooms with capacity into computer labs that should not have capacity because they're not used as a classroom each day, we in fact change fish. The state comes along every 5 years and does a sampling of our schools. In our case, it's about 6 schools. We have consistently been at in excess of 99% accuracy in our FISH database, which takes into account not only that we've measured it correctly, the square feet, but the use of it and the student stations assigned to it. Now, we do miss one or two. In other words, as a teacher this year principal this year decides to make this classroom a special use, and it isn't quite a classroom, if the DOE were to come along that particular year and see it not being used as a classroom, they might question us. But in fact, we are in excess of 99% accurate on the FISH database. Now, I think what you were saying is, so we do change it each and every year. In fact, weekly, we go out there and look at one or two schools. What you, I think, were alluding to was the fact that if it isn't accurate, in fact, we're using the space so that our capacity is less than the FISH database, which in fact is the case. They don't recognize, they don't allow us to put in enough ESE spaces. They don't
Computer
recognize some of the, they don't recognize, for instance, Head Start or pre-K. Pre-K ESE gets FTE, but pre-K does not, so VPK. So in fact, our COFTE numbers are much lower than our membership numbers, but they don't recognize some of the things that we try to do as a district. And therefore, that's why I say we are effectively full at about 90, 91, 92%, depending on the school, of FISH capacity. So that we call that program capacity. If you were to use program capacity to, instead of FISH capacity in this, you would in fact be lowering your capacity and exacerbate the problem that we're trying to address here, where you would be restricting schools. In other words, on a FISH capacity, a school has, let's say, 800 students, an elementary school. If you were to say, I'm going to develop my own program capacity, and that was 700 students as a capacity, you would in fact be lowering the bar at which we would eliminate students from coming into that school. Do you see where that goes? So I think the state doesn't recognize program capacity. There are a couple of districts out there that generate their own. It is not recognized. It would be challenged in court by developers if you were to try to use that for concurrency. We could certainly use it for this, but I think it, as I said, exacerbates the problem of restricting students coming in for convenience. So I would advocate using the FISH capacity.
Anybody else? Thoughts?
Go to the next page.
Okay, next page. Let's look at definitions H through M.
Yeah, did she say?
Well, I know I would like to eliminate soft redistricting. I know Dana and I lived that. Karen, I think you were here when we did that.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It was a nightmare.
It created a problem rather than fixing a problem.
So
Yes.
I am proposing that we eliminate soft redistricting. For those of you that didn't live that, that meant that if you were in a neighborhood that got rezoned to another neighborhood, if you were in a school, you got to stay, but anybody that was new to that neighborhood went to another school. It was,
And it became costly, because what happened, and right here in this area of Manatee and Quest, when Manatee was built, everybody was.
Karen, we can't hear you.
And what happened after time, when we had both schools, Manatee and Quest, is that people from Manatee could not go to Manatee, so they were bused to Quest. And so we had buses going both ways. We in just that area, I think we had like 6 extra buses based on soft redistricting, just in that area, but it was all over. And so it's nice, it sounds good, but in reality, we found that it was expensive and created more problems because, like, when I moved in, I can look and see Williams Elementary, but I was told that I couldn't go to that school, although I could see it. And so then my kids wouldn't be going to school with the neighborhood kids that I moved in with. So it is more of a problem than a creative solution.
As a principal who had experienced soft redistricting, it caused major community confusion. And therefore, when parents would come to register, you'd be like, well, my neighbor comes here, why can't my students get? Well, no, I'm sorry, you have to get, but I agree with you. I wholeheartedly feel like
It
we
needs to
need
be
to get rid
eliminated.
of soft redistricting.
I would also suggest on letter J that we're consistent with other places that we list that they have sibling preference, but we have not listed on here that they need to meet the entrance requirements. You'll, just because we had an issue this year, well, you notice here that all we say is that siblings and current students have preference, but I would suggest we add the same language that they must meet the entrance requirements.
And we can do that. That's addressed in 5120, but I will include
I
that.
just think for consistency,
Ms. Nisi, I believe in criteria for employee preference, which starts at the bottom of page 3, and I think it says on A on page 4, if the child meets the entry requirements of the projected.
true, I was looking just under sibling preference in general.
Okay.
Right.
I know, I just want to be consistent that it's always listed because we've really got challenged on that this year.
Correct.
And I just don't want there to be any question.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want to have another discussion on school-based employees. I know this came up at a board meeting, and I just want to have another discussion because of what we consider a school-based employee of the district. And I'm still opposed to the idea that schools that are adjacent to each other, such as Meadow Lane Primary, Meadow Lane Intermediate, Indy Atlantic, and Hoover, Satellite and Delora, West.
Turner and Southwest.
Yeah. We have about five schools that are literally next door to each other. And I would like to have those special circumstances added to the list here as being school-based.
I think then we need to consider ESF then. And we're adjacent to Viera High, which will get us a problem in the future.
Then I would add that then. That would be my, when you're right next door to each other, there's so little we can do for our employees because of the financial situation. And I know it opens doors, and I know that we're not all going to agree on this issue. This is one that I feel passionate about. So I guess I'm going to throw it out there and see if we have two others that feel that way. So any other comments?
I would think that, going back to your first statement, Mrs. Nisi, about possibly redistricting Indy Atlantic, that making sure that, I understand you have the adjacent of the middle and the elementary, but you need to ensure that there's the adjacent schools on either end of that are also balanced before you do that, rather than creating another problem. Adding more capacity to the school, even though they're right there, when there's plenty of room to make a redistricting solution that would prevent you actually having to do that policy in that particular one. I understand it's not going to happen everywhere, but I think that the solution should be balancing your capacity first.
If I
Anybody
may
else?
chime in too, we also need to add that the school-based employees caveat kicks in when the school's at 100% or higher. The other thing is that we need to be a little bit more direct in what is a school-based employee.
that's what I want to do that
This
too.
is a BPS employee, not health department, not
Correct.
an SRO. They
Well-
must be
Well, let's
employed
get to
by
that
us.
too in a minute, but let me first talk about expanding what is school-based employee, but don't lose track of those notes. Misty?
I would agree with what Ms. Henderson said as far as looking at balancing capacity as a whole,
Correct.
but I don't think that those are mutually exclusive conversations. I think it still goes back to the idea that I brought forth initially when this conversation came up, and that is that if I live in Titusville and I teach in Palm Bay, and my child is in Titusville because there's not room at the school in Palm Bay for my child to attend, the district is losing, my child is losing, my students are losing. And so to me, this seems like a simple enough thing. We're not talking hundreds of children. We're talking, a handful of employees at the schools that it's going to impact. And I understand that there may be some negative consequences that we're going to have to adjust to going forward, but I think the benefits of it for all involved outweigh those negative consequences for letting those employees have their children closer to them.
Before we come back, any others want to weigh in?
So listen.
Okay, Karen?
I just don't know how you do that without including schools that are next to each other. Anderson and Kennedy. I can still be from Titusville, work at Anderson, my kid could go to Kennedy. But I can't because it's not really an adjacent school, it's actually a mile away, but I drive right back past Kennedy. So I think, for me, the whole definition of this and I think that there's more to this, and then, does everybody want to work at Indialantic because their kid can go to Hoover? Now we can't get people for other schools because you've only taken 5 out of the 87 schools that have this benefit.
I think adjacent's pretty clear. I mean, you can walk out the back door and go right next door to the other one. I mean, Delora and Satellite actually share a media center. Meadow Lane, primary and intermediate, you actually just go in one door and out the other. I mean, I think adjacent is pretty clear.
And I understand that. I'm just saying, for teachers who are coming from another part, who are live in Titusville and go to work in Palm Bay, who might be across the street a mile away, drive right by the school, you're denying them that same thing. And I just think that there's a concern there for me.
But there are benefits to a lot of, if I teach at Endeavor, I get an extra $150. I mean, there are benefits at other schools that you get when you work there. And that is a benefit if I work at, say, Indialantic, that I would be able to access the school next door. So there are schools that you get benefits for working there, yes. Yes.
I think eventually I would love to get to the point where we can also incorporate that school that's a mile away. I think initially, if we collectively can agree to adjacent properties, we're moving in the right direction. We can get an idea of the impact, and then we can plan going forward to incorporate those other schools with input from Ms. Archer and Mr. Theodore, and Dr. Blackburn as well, now that he is on board to take a look at those things. But I do think that at least those adjacent properties, especially in the areas like Indialantic, where it's very limited what is close by, I think that would be important for those employees.
I would also like to include, well, before we move on to what constitutes a school-based employee, did you want to add more to the adjacent school conversation, Karen? I know you had a situation, Misty, where the school nurse in the building who's there every day did not qualify under what was school-based employee because they were employed by the health department, not by our school. And to me, that is someone, I guess, someone that's in that school every day. To me, the school nurse should fall under this policy, but as it's currently written, did not. And so who are the people that would not fall under our policy right now, Stephanie?
Anybody who's not directly employed by BPS. So health department is the one, SROs have come into play and others. So because our SROs, some are sheriff's departments, some are TPDs. Our Titusville Police Department is an example. So they would not qualify.
We could fix that real quick by changing it from saying school district employees to school-based everywhere. Then you're not defining who they work for, just that they're a school-based employee.
Would that do it, Stephanie?
I think so. I think it might. Those are the only 2 examples that I can come up with in the past. The other question is, what about some of our itinerants who work in 5 or 6 different schools, our speech pathologists, our PTs, our OTs? At what point in time do we tell them? And again, because this all boils down to capacity issues, it is going to come back and bite us in class size amendment, in teacher allocations,
Well, I was
and
going
those
to say a
type of
school-based
things.
employee who works at a school 3 or more days a week. It would seem they would need to be there at least so many days a week.
Well, but like a speech pathologist is moving around
All the time.
constantly.
An itinerant, yes.
So should they be there a set number of days, or can they pick a school that is convenient? I mean, I'm asking you guys.
And school site, colleges are often assigned 5 different schools.
True. I guess they are, I mean, I'm fine with just school-based then.
The itinerant employees,
Are
don't
actually based.
most itinerant employees have a work location? I know like for like mileage reimbursement purposes, correct me if I'm wrong, Judy, and I am the new kid on the block, but to reimburse for mileage, even though I'm itinerant and I travel to multiple locations, don't we typically pick a location to determine where is home base, so to speak?
Some do, some don't. It depends on the area of the district. Some of our psychologists might actually have room in a school or, and they can work from there, and others are in our area offices. So it varies from area to area.
Okay. And I think, I mean, I heard capacity mentioned. I mean, all of I would think these allowances consider whether or not there is room in
Correct.
the school. We would not create an allowance to over-enroll a school, right? It's fair to say?
No, that's not true. When we make a school-based
What they
employee.
want to do is they want to do that. They want to overcrowd it.
You already have a school.
Karen, you know.
No, but you're, because this came up earlier this year with Indy Atlantic. And it was already over capacity, but the issue was that they worked at Hoover, and they still wanted their kids to go to Indy Atlantic, which was already over capacity, but it's an adjacent school.
It was over permanent or?
Currently.
Over permanent.
Over
Currently,
permanent.
employee preference, currently, if you're an employee here of the district, you can, it's in here somewhere, you can send your child to any school. How does that work?
Except for the choice schools.
Except you can send your child to any school but the choice schools, correct?
I think it's limited. If
Go ahead, Dane.
It's in here somewhere.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it, but I know that it limits.
Oh, here we go.
It limits it at
Last page.
100%, yeah.
It says, "Children of school district employees may attend any school with the exception of the schools of choice as an out-of-area student if the student meets the entry requirements and the projected enrollment does not exceed the school's permanent capacity." So it doesn't exceed 100%. So
So what they're trying to do is create 2 schools as one for the permanent capacity.
But then B says, only children of school-based employees working at the schools, okay. But if you work in the school, you can always bring your child with
Correct.
you regardless of what the capacity is. And so the question came down to, well, what is a school-based employee? So like Beachside, let's go back to Meadow Lane, where they're literally a doorway apart from each other. That was where we came down to the issue. It does not seem right that you could work in Meadow Lane Intermediate and your child not be able to attend Meadow Lane Primary, or vice versa. And that's why we wanted to allow for adjacent schools to have that, to those be considered school-based employees.
I think we'll cause confusion if we call them school-based employees because they're not based out of there. I think you just need to say school employees. If that's the way we're going to operate, then I think we need to eliminate that keyword. There's enough confusion that surrounds out of area. We don't need to add to the
Okay.
mystery.
Do we need to call them adjacent school employees at the following locations and actually list them?
Let me look at something just very quickly.
Because I do think the two areas that will be of concern for overcrowding will be Delora and Satellite, and Indy Atlantic and Hoover, but I think with redistricting Beachside, some of that will help. But we have other areas that will be affected too.
As long as we're consistent in our application, there are going to be ramifications we haven't seen yet. And I said in our meeting when we first started discussing this, when we are asking another family to leave to make room for our own employees, that's bothersome to me, because you're asking a child who could have been there for several years, I'm sorry, we are now over capacity, you need to go to your home zone school, but meanwhile, we're going to fill that same seat with another out-of-area student simply because they're an employee. So I just think we need to consider that. I don't know how you would implement that fairly or equitably, because it is a case-by-case basis.
Ms. Vaughn?
Well, I think going to that issue, and I certainly understand your concern there, Ms. Archer, on not kicking other students out. But if I'm an employee, if I'm a new teacher hired at Indy Atlantic, and Indy Atlantic is already over capacity, and I come to Indy Atlantic and I happen to have a second grader, are you going to kick a student out to make room for my second grader?
They would have to balance their out of areas. Usually, if you're at over 100, if you're at 101% or higher, you have to ask your out of area students to return to their home zone school unless they are the child of a school-based employee.
And that starts at the
bottom
bottom
level,
and works
kindergarten
up,
up, or
But the
in
question
middle
would
school,
be,
7th, and
yes,
so on.
it could.
It could happen.
And so it wouldn't really make a difference if I were a teacher who was working at Indy Atlantic or if I was a teacher working at Hoover. The outcome for the other students would still be the same, correct?
Correct.
But you just increased their odds.
Yeah, if I may. I think everyone would understand intuitively that if a teacher comes into Indy Atlantic and that causes an out-of-area, convenience out-of-area student to leave, I think everyone would intuitively understand that. I think it would be less so, though, that if they came in from an adjacent school, they weren't at that particular school, and they came in and caused that situation. I also think that it would be perhaps equally as troublesome if a non-employee, such as and I don't mean to pick on one particular type, but an SRO or a health, or Cindy pointed out that now we're going to have, based at Endeavor, the grant people who could be
I was just
considered.
thinking of that,
Yeah, so I think it's, I think.
It's a slippery slope.
Let me make a suggestion. The policy right now says school employees, school district employees can come in to a school up to 100%, and school-based employees don't have any restrictions. If you're a school-based employee, you can bring your child in, your student in, under any circumstance. It could be 120% of permanent capacity. I would make a recommendation that you leave that policy in place, because it's a pretty straightforward policy. It's difficult enough for Stephanie to administer now, but I would make a recommendation that you would leave it in place and allow any unusual circumstance. Let's say, Ms. Belford, you have that adjacent school. Let that be an exception, because there's policy language in there that allows the superintendent flexibility to address those exceptions. And I don't believe that there will be that many of them if you restrict it to school district employees. If you open it up to school-based employees, such as SROs and grant and whatnot, I think you're going to have a lot more of them, which may be problematic. So, I think you can deal with this as an exception, but if you're limited to school district employees.
Could we talk about maybe adding another category such as that, where we could evaluate that on a case-by-case basis as it applies to class size amendment, as it applies to our permanent capacity, and maybe have an additional line item here that addresses employees, outside employees at a school, and then we could look at it. I can tell you now, Endeavor has no room. They're maxed out at capacity. But based on class size, there might be the availability. Now,
Well, could we
playing
at
devil's
least-
advocate, then
Could we
you
at
can't-
least in this point A, where we talk about employees being able to bring their children up to the 100%, where it says children of school district employees, could we put children of school-based employees may attend any school with the exception of, as long as they don't exceed the school district? That one would at least get the school nurse up to the 100%. That A, you know, where it's A and B on page 404, at least that's what the one,
Oh, you're on, I'm sorry, I'm still on page 2.
sorry, I skipped back to the A and B that's right above criteria.
Gotcha. Mhm.
Because, you know, that one would catch most of those people, where it has children of school district employees may attend any school. That one would, you know, if that would be children of school-based employees may attend any school. That would catch the SRO, the nurse and all of that, and that would still keep it at the 100% capacity that all of our other employees have. That would solve a lot of the problems that we've encountered this year. That would be I mean, that would be, and we wouldn't be getting into the Indy Atlantic situation and so forth. That would, I mean, that would make me happy. And I still wouldn't be
So-
putting kids at Indy Atlantic then.
So say that again?
Back here, okay, back here on this one,
Little slow.
right above the criteria for special schools and programs.
Uh-huh.
This children of school district employees, you know, that's the one perk we have, that they can attend any school with the exception of schools of choice as long as they don't exceed the permanent capacity.
Right.
That this would be children of our school-based, see, school district means they can't be the SRO, the school nurse.
Right.
If we would change that to school-based employees,
Or if we could rephrase it
Or
and say,
rephrase it.
children of employees based at schools.
Because you're using
But
the
this-
term school-based
Yeah.
employee later in that same
Correct.
paragraph.
Oh, okay.
To describe, to differentiate a school district
Okay.
employee vice one who's actually employed at that
well,
individual
what's
school
I
site.
was using, what term would work, Stephanie, so that we could include the nurse and the?
I'll play with that with my team, because actually, we're looking anyway at changing a lot of our phraseology in our department, because there's so much confusion between choice and out of area. We're
Okay.
trying to change some of our terms.
Because the issue we had, it seems silly that a school nurse can't
Right.
bring her child to that school if she's there, you know, that was the example.
I'll have my team brainstorm. We'll come up with verbiage that sounds better.
Yeah, let me suggest something. Mrs. Nisi, I think what you're saying here is that you would like a employee of a school, whether it's a school district employee or not, to bring their child to that school. Would you agree that that would occur up to 100%, but unless it's a school district employee, they could not exceed 100%? So we would modify that last sentence in some way to say that unless they're a school district employee, the capacity issue restriction would not apply to school-based school district
Well,
employees.
although I'd like that, I'm willing to hold off on that as long as we include some language about, you know, the superintendent will review extenuating circumstances. You know, we talked about that. You know, if you have a unique situation.
Right.
You know, the single mother who's working at the school next door, that type of thing.
Well, we usually ask our principals when we train, if you have a special circumstance to advocate for, to give our office a call.
But
to give
some are
us some of
better
the-
than that than others, so I just want to make sure.
Okay.
Does that, and then also, you know, we really need to push the redistricting in a couple of our areas too.
Correct.
Does that, what do you guys think about that?
I kind of like Ms. Starcher's suggestion of defining those employees separately. But in the case, but then we were mentioning permanent capacity. I think that also should be non-restricted school, just like we have here, school-based. It says the capacity restriction does not apply to school-based. So I think that should carry forward to that other group also, but I think it would be cleaner the way you're suggesting to define it separately.
Correct.
So
We
it
can.
looks- So in the beginning, we don't have a definite, okay, so we need to make sure we have a definition of school-based. So you need to, up in the beginning, better define school-based employees, school district employees, so that you can include those categories of people, like our nurses, our SROs, et cetera.
We'll get that done.
And since we don't have year-round schools anymore, we can get rid of that and any reference to soft redistricting.
All reference.
All references. It doesn't exist anymore.
And would that apply to schools of choice, since it already says school-based employees working at schools of choice? It doesn't say school district employees, which would technically imply that currently the SRO and nurse could bring their student there.
As long as they meet entrance criteria, correct?
Right.
But we have to be careful of that because we don't want somebody else who would say, well, I'm a school district employee, so now I want my child at Freedom 7. And so we're going to have to phrase
Correct.
this very carefully.
Right. That's why you get the big box. Yes, Misty.
One more, Mrs. Archer. As you are working through those definitions, I did notice that we reference magnet and choice programs in
Yes.
some of the policies, but we don't have a definition of what qualifies as a magnet school, and those schools are not identified, and we don't have a definition of a choice program. We have a reference to CTE.
And well, I'll let the cat out of the bag. My team and I are talking about changing and looking and changing the phrases, as I said before, and talk about educational program options, which would then do any school that has a program that would attract families, whether it be magnet, CTE, what have you, as opposed to a locational education option, which simply means I want to move the location of my child. We're fine-tuning some of our wording because to say choice has confused our community
Yes.
quite a bit. And so when parents call our office, we spend a lot of time just asking key questions.
Which
When you
choice do you
reference-
want?
Right. When you
Well,
say
and they
choice,
confuse
what are we
charter
talking?
with choice and
Yes,
yes.
yes. So
We need to-
we are really trying to shore that up before we get rolling into this next application cycle. So those are some of the things we will be looking at. I also know that we need to look carefully at sibling. Sibling preference only applies to our 5 choice schools at this time. It does not apply to out of area, and a lot of parents want to know why. That's the hard part about Policy 7120. It does not guarantee families can stay together. So
Did you
may
want to
have-
put something about wait list in here you and I talked
Yeah,
about?
that's another new thing that we're going to do in our application for out of areas is we are going to give principals the opportunity to wait list children. So we have instances where they are trying to very carefully monitor their class size. We ask for an April 10th deadline. That April 10th deadline comes very quickly, but they may have space as the year goes on to take in a few more students and still observe class size amendment and still not go over their par, because I know the area superintendents would not be happy with me and if I let them just enroll and they all go to the table at 6-day count asking for teachers. So that's not what we'll do. It will also help people who move into our area in June or July who weren't given the option to do an out of area. And so they may apply and they can sit on a wait list if there's a certain allotment of time. Again, we have to watch our timing very carefully because we don't want to get too close to the beginning of the school year and cause a hullabaloo with kids moving back and forth. So we'll look at something like that. But I think that will eliminate some of the concerns as well from a parent standpoint.
Okay. Other questions?
So what happened with the
Adjacent schools.
adjacent
Yeah,
schools? We
that's where I am.
kind of went off track on that. Are we back to that? Are there?
I guess we kind of,
I don't think it's a good
I don't think we've, I mean, I didn't get 3 people that agreed to it, so.
I agree that if they're adjacent or contiguous properties, that's school-based. So in case, especially in case like the Meadow Lanes, I mean, that's really, and that's an interesting example because there are many times in conversation we consider those 2 schools one school for certain decisions, and we consider them separate schools for other decisions where we're inconsistent. So to say we're going to consider them separate schools for employee preference is hypocritical if we're going to consider them one school for other decisions. So then you get into saying, well, okay, that's a logical conversation for those 2 schools. Well, then that extends it to contiguous properties. But
Except for the Meadowlanes are elementaries, and we're including elementaries and middle schools at different cases. And I'm just going to tell you, I remember this conversation when we first went through this policy and wanted to include teacher employees, school employees, and we had people here saying we didn't, that's not fair, you're giving the employees, a benefit, which we thought was fair. And we overrode what the people who didn't want us to do that. I do think that you're going to end up with what's going to be considered not fair by a lot of people because it's kind of just opens it up. Because if you're going to do these 5 schools, there's going to be an argument why you can't do Anderson and Kennedy, or why you can't do, Manatee and Viera, or Quest and Viera. It's going to come. And so I just think that, we really need to understand that. I understand the concept.
Make sure you talk in microphone.
I understand the concept of what you want to do, but I think that it's going to just bring up a bigger issue that is going to be much more complicated and much more hurtful to more people than what you're trying to do.
And I guess the only comment I make to that is, so what our teachers hear then is that it's okay to hurt them in favor of the public. And I know that's not your intent when you say that, Mrs. Henderson.
No, that's not it. No,
But
not even close.
that's what our teachers hear, is that they, again, take the brunt because they don't want to upset the public. And
Well, again,
So-
this whole thing
so-
could have been taken care of with a redistricting, if we want to talk about the one school that had this issue. So,
and I never said I was opposed to it, Karen.
I know, but what I'm saying is we're trying to write a policy for this one instance.
That's not
And-
true. I
So-
disagree with that. They're two separate issues.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I would suggest, that we have a new superintendent.
Really?
It is not the job of
Shiny
this
new.
board to get in the weeds. It is the job of the board to set policy based on information and the recommendation from the superintendent on how to adjust his school. So what I would like to see is the superintendent
Decide what to do.
roundtable it, socialize it with his leadership, and bring us forth 2 or 3 solutions
Yeah.
that probably includes not doing anything as one of them. But then we can then adjust policy based on solid information rather than us individually trying to
Right.
micromanage in the weeds.
Right.
Because that's really not what we're here for.
But defining what is school-based
Well,
and
that's
district,
exa-
but that is policy.
Oh, that
and
part. I'm talking about this specific thing that we're discussing right now that we just came back to. So this,
Right.
whether schools that are adjacent, whether the ESF is adjacent to Viera, well, all that type of stuff, I think we need a suggestion. We need
True.
proposals brought to us
So that we can set policy.
then set a policy that supports that.
Exactly.
I concur.
I would suggest anything that helps employee morale, even if it creates, as Mrs. Henderson said, maybe creates some difficulties. There's no such thing as a perfect decision, but I think we really need to err on the side of what's in our employees' best interest. And I want to throw out another little anomaly about the meadow lanes. So while that may open up a can of worms, you have a situation that already exists in the meadow lanes where you have a classroom from the intermediate school and the primary school. So you could have an intermediate teacher teaching in the primary facility, but their kid can't go to the primary facility even though they're actually in that physical building. So, I mean, I would advocate that that situation should be rectified almost immediately because it's a very unfair situation for the employees of those 2 schools. But I will support adjacent properties very wholeheartedly as being open to employee preference.
Misty?
I just wanted to add on that issue. I think where we perceive there to be a lot of hurt to other families in those schools, we could simply address that by saying that we are not going to move students out of the school based on employee children. We're basing this measure on permanent capacity, not total capacity. And so to say that we don't really have room at these schools for those employees' children to be included without other children being excluded, I think is narrowing our mindset a little too much. So, Dr. Blackburn, when you look at this issue, would you just keep that in the back of your mind?
Okay.
Yes.
And Dr. Blackburn, I would just like for the record to know it actually wasn't the Hoover and the Atlantic. It was actually the Meadow Lane that made this bring to my attention for exactly the reasons Andy said. Regardless of what Karen said, it's not the beachside issue. Jane will actually know that last week I did bring to her attention that I was ready to take on in fact, Cindy, you heard me say it too, I'm ready to take on the beachside redistricting. I brought it up to both of them last week. But Meadow Lane is the one that the adjacent issue is just so apparent that we have to talk about adjacent schools. So I would really welcome you taking a look at it.
So the staff and I, we can consider everything that we discussed today
And more.
and take the opportunity to bring back recommended language or multiple recommendations
Whatever you wanna
for the
do.
board to take a look at.
Okay, is there, Misty?
Are we wrapping up our discussion on 7120
I
completely?
was planning to, unless
Okay.
you,
9:30.
Can I throw in just
Absolutely,
one or
take your
two
time.
last things? I have concerns about us telling students that they cannot leave a school regardless of the capacity. And my feeling is that we need to do a really good job to ensure that students want to go to those schools
I
as
agree.
opposed to telling them that they can't leave. So Dr. Blackburn, if you could please look at that as well when you're having that discussion. And then,
May I pipe in here, Ms. Belford?
Sure.
I just want to let you know, I know we took Stone off of our list of frozen to outgoing last year, and they've felt little to nothing of the impact. As a matter of fact, they've grown in capacity in their magnet applications. So, and I know in the past, it's been beachside schools, but really they trade. If you leave Holland and you go to Roosevelt, Roosevelt just lost somebody to go to Holland. So there really hasn't been any mass exodus from any of our 75 or under schools. I know why we try to, but if we look at that and the number of applications that I go through and approve, there really hasn't been a whole lot. So we may want to reconsider that, just my personal
sometimes where I have
perspective.
the issue to the frozen is when a school used to be frozen, and then they get up to 80 or something %, and then they're unfrozen. And so then you get a group that leaves, and all of a sudden that school's down to 70%. And so they go back and forth. One year they're frozen, one year they're not, one year they're frozen. And that really makes it hard for a school when they're on, they're off, they're on, they're off. Yes?
So, Mr. Theodore, as long as you're here and you passed out all this information. And I bring this up because it's been in the newspaper that there's a possibility that we need to build new capacity for new incoming students over the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years in different areas. And the projected capacity in some of those does support, certainly looking at that. But of course, one jumps off the page at everybody, and that'd be COCO. And we put ourselves in that position. So what are we going to do?
Well,
Because it's far and above anything that has been reported in the newspaper for all these new incoming tons of students into these new areas in Vieira and in West Melbourne. But there's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. Well, what we look at in terms of projecting the need for new capacity is, can we solve the problem with program changes? And as we develop, as my department develops some potential scenarios, recommendations, which we bring to senior staff, we bring to the superintendent, and senior staff we discuss with the area superintendents. For COCO, there are a couple of mitigating factors for the need for new capacity. One would be relocation of programs. We've talked with the area superintendent, Jane Klein, about potential relocation of some programs there. We have discussed the possibility of rezoning, and we have the ability to, in the north area, do a potential rezoning there. We can bring in additional portables. So I think in the situation of COCO, and this year I believe that they were significantly under projection. I've not seen the numbers yet, but my understanding is that they are about, Jane, 70, 80 below, about 70 or 80 below projection, which was their projected growth this year. So we did bring in 2 additional portables this year. They didn't grow. I think they were projected to grow about 80, and they didn't experience any growth. So we brought in 2 additional portables to address that growth, and they would be available for next year's growth. So I see if our projections, and remember the projections are based on a lot of new development up there. We see a lot of approved developments in that Cocoa area. If they come online and we get done with a potential program relocation, again, which we've talked about, which would open up about 4 classrooms, a potential rezoning, which would be, we've looked at about 150 students, we've done some what-if scenarios. I think unless these developments exceed what we're thinking about, we're okay there for the next 4 to 5 years.
Do we, I'm wondering, because I know we have an executive session to get to, student progression plan I know is on our next board agenda. I'm thinking maybe we need to have some more discussion about these items and the capacities, because those are included in the student progression plan, aren't they? Some of the numbers, the capacities, aren't they in there?
No, the student accommodation.
Student accommodations.
Student accommodation plan, that's the 5-year plan?
Yeah. I'm wondering, do you want to carry this over to the board meeting?
That's fine. I just think it's important that we bring it up. I mean, this is we put ourselves in this position, and I say we collectively. And it, when you get the media saying that we're going to build new schools, whether it's correct or not, in areas that are not severely affected, and then all of a sudden we decide that maybe we'll move some programs from a heavily Title I area, or we're going to redistrict. That's probably not the answer. So we need to probably have a more deep dive into that, if you would.
Yeah, I would say in the future, we're going to really need to dive into this. When, the student accommodation plan then, when does that next one come out, or did we just?
No, the student accommodation plan comes out in March for approval in April. You'll be seeing
student progression plan, accommodation plan, I mean, all these
You'll be
different
seeing the 5-year facility plan.
Okay, at some point, we need to dive into that as a board. So I don't know when is the time, but John's exactly right. We need to have a time to dig in and get into these numbers a little bit. So I don't know when we want to plan that, but I would say sometime in the next couple of months, we need to dig into these numbers a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So just add that to your radar. No, you don't agree, Karen? Okay. Okay. I know we have executive session to get to, so any other business? We're adjourned. Okay, 5 minutes. We'll get into executive session.